do we want to, as a group, sort of recap from last week? What did we talk about? And then briefly, and then let's overview that, and then we can talk about reflections from last week, and we can discuss intentions for this week. So I recall where we left off at the end. We got into the three virtues of wisdom, courage, and temperance, and we were on a quest for justice. Does anyone else recall what occurred before that? I recall there was discussion of music and gymnastics again, and then there was some kind of coming down from the frame of the state back into the individual, as though they were offering commentary on the soul. Does anybody else kind of have any, remember what stuck out to them?
Yeah, I think that was part of the theme, was this going up and down again, right? This back and forth between the view or perspective of the city and the view or perspective of the individual, and how those two things interact, right? Because it seems to be a lot of issue about interaction and exemplification through, this must be so, right? And if this person were perfect, then this must, right? These other things must be true, right? So that seems to be like a bigger theme in book 4 than it has been in the past, right? In wealth and poverty and luxury and all of those concepts, just to see how that all works together.
Yes, I remember we got stuck on happiness for a while, and we underlined this point that they made. We aren't aiming to make any one group outstandingly happy, but to make the whole city, so. Remember that?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, the state's set up for the good of the whole, which is a utilitarian perspective. One thing I noticed from this morning was that they mentioned, like, should we beautify the eyes to a degree such that they are no longer eyes? Like, we have to keep proper proportions of things because we're getting into harmony with temperance. But they did mention, like, they made a mention in the top of the chapter saying, like, the eyes ought to be purple. And then getting into today, they talk about purple, like if you're going to dye a garment, you need to start with pure white. As though, to me, I interpreted that in terms of like purity. They may say temperance or proper proportion, something like that. But I think there was some kind of foreshadowing around this concept of proper proportions or something.
Do we happen to know what the Greek word was that they used for temperance or moderation?
Casey looked that up twice. I don't remember the Greek word, but Casey has it in some commentary. I don't have any commentary, so that is actually, last week I was saying, balance was kind of like one of my themes of engagement, and I don't know what happened in my week, but I feel really good. So I don't know. I feel really good. I feel better than I felt in a long time. Well, I'm still not 100%. I feel like 70%, but that's better than I felt in months. So I'm starting to come back finally, online finally. Balance is part of that.
Why were you feeling bad before, Danny?
I was working a demanding job and working all the time. But then there were also a bunch of other issues. I had some health issues. And then there were just a bunch of emergencies, like a bunch of different emergencies. So.
Sorry to hear that.
But part of balance is knowing what your boundaries are, what you're willing to do for what, knowing, what you're willing, how much of your energy and attention you're willing to spend on certain things. So part of that is kind of like, I don't know if knowing thyself is a way to put it. That's a degree of it. But also knowing yourself, in order to know yourself, you also have to participate in the world and know where you are in a story. What is my role when I'm engaging in this group or at work, or what is my role in this little story? Each story is a little bit different so, and that's part of that's a skill. Part of it is not a skill, but part of it is a skill. Like like if you get locked up at home and can't have to wear a mask for a long time and can't go out, you're going to lose social skills, and that's going to maybe change the way that you view yourself with respect to people your age, maybe even. So, all right. So I've been doing kind of lots of rambling. Anybody else have any reflections on last week?
There was the one, we spent some time on this. They're kind of going over some of the laws, and talking about where I'm looking at the spot here. What is left for us to deal with under the heading of legislation? For us, nothing. But the Delphic Apollo, it remains to enact the greatest, finest, and first of laws. So I remember we went over that. They're saying we have no knowledge of these things, and in establishing our city, if we have any understanding, we won't be persuaded to trust them to anyone other than the ancestral guide. And this God, sitting upon the rock at the center of the earth, is without a doubt the ancestral guide on these matters for all people. Something that modern people would probably tend to skip over that little section. So in other words, reason is limited, and it must be, well, for them it's coming out of the dead, but it has to come somewhere that's not reasonable or not rational, right? Ancestral guide.
Another thing, I don't know if I mean, it is irrational to some extent, but one thing that, like, the Guardians are known for having a strong self-restraint. And I think one theme that hasn't really, like, I don't think hasn't really come up at all, certainly not in like a more mature way, was like motivation. I mean, they talk about concepts of self-mastery, but one of the things that I'm kind of interested in is for the Greeks or this text or the ancients, like, what is that gusto? The thing where you go from being at rest to not at rest, that strength, like, what is it, that force? How do they view what we would call maybe like, oh, I'm in a state of motivation? Because that's also kind of where my mind's at too. I'm starting to kind of heal up a bit. My vitality's coming back a little bit. It's not back yet, but I'm probably 4 weeks from now, I'll be turning the corner to, like, all right, I want to really, like, work as hard as I can. I'm feeling like I want to work as hard as I can at something. That's kind of something, how to determine, like, what should I pour myself into? What's a worthy mission, or whatever it is. How do you even come to form that discernment?
Passions. Yeah, that's all passions from the Greeks.
So that's something I'm interested to maybe explore. Maybe that'd be my intention for this week. That's something that I'm kind of curious to explore. Discovering the passions, gaining maturity with your passions, or however you want to put that. But that was kind of a theme that sort of it's crept up in the past a little bit. So that's kind of where my mind is for this week.
Trying to think if there's anything in here regarding that.
No, it's not in 4.
Yeah, at the end. Before.
What do you mean at the end?
Or, like, so they talk about the 3 virtues: wisdom, courage, and temperance, and then they talk about the nature of desire. They say there's the simple of desire, and then there's the qualified desire. Like, if you're thirsty, and they say, because we're on a quest for justice, for the sake of what we're after, which is to explore justice, we want to just talk about the simple desire of thirst as an exemplification of something. I don't know exactly, but there is, like, anytime you have, like, a desire, you can.
Right. They talk about a desire. They're not talking about the passions. So yeah, fair enough.
I was really interested to know what word they used for desire in this text. So I am curious about that. I don't think it's
when they were talking about that, they're kind of setting something up so they could examine justice. I should have thumbed through this last night. I remember what you're talking about. They're like, okay, so doesn't that which forbids in such cases come into play, if it comes into play at all, as a role of rational calculation, while that drives and drags them to drink is a result of feelings and disease, apparently.
I think sorry.
Go ahead.
Oh, I think you're close. There is an explicit line where they say good is the universal object of desire. And I think that's what they were using with that qualification metaphor. Sometimes if it's cold, you might want a hot drink. And if it's hot, you might want a cold drink. We could qualify the concept of desire for thirst. But for us, for the metaphor that we're using, we're just going to want to say justice is then, I'm actually having to connect this. If good is the universal object of desire, justice is, I can't remember. This is at the end of the chapter. They connect these dots for you, actually. I just didn't finish it. Anyway, I guess we're kind of jumping ahead here, right?
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah. So
So
you've got an intent. Do you want to? Does somebody else want to do reflection and intent?
Oh, sorry. I didn't realize that's what we're doing.
Yeah, we're still beginning. Yeah, I mean, I can reflect. I mean, I don't know that much around book four came up for me this week, but it's always helpful to have that framing that they use because it is a unique framing. Uh, when you're thinking about other things, and then yeah, my intent is just to get a better understanding of the second half of chapter four because actually I kind of struggle where they were going with all this. It's a wear on me with the well, if you have one man, then it must be so, and there's all this for the city, and it's like, oh, what are you guys talking about? Why are you being crazy? So I think that's just wearing on me, but yeah, that's what I've got for reflection and intent.
Um, reflection. Yeah. Seems like they're reflection on the four virtues, the three virtues, the three parts of the soul, and how to. Sorry, it's gonna sound dumb. It's probably been the same thing for me. How to be a more just soul.
Mm.
Probably the same thing I keep saying. Yeah, I really wish I would have thumbed through this again. Well,
hey,
so what do we do
sorry,
now?
go ahead, Ethan. If hey, did you have any thoughts about chapter four, the first half of chapter four, and or thoughts on how you want to engage with the second half of chapter four?
I actually don't remember what I have read, but you were speaking about desire. So I remember in the symposium, Socrates said that you only desire what you don't have, what you are lacking. So if you desire goodness, that means you are lacking in goodness. If you are already good, or you believe you are already good, you don't desire goodness, right? Because it's something that's part of you already. Similarly, when we think we are lacking in money, then we desire money. We lack in love, then we desire love. And if we lack in governance, self-governing, we desire governments, to govern or to be governed.
Hey, Casey. Hey, we were wrapping up reflections from the first half of chapter four, and then doing intentions for second half of chapter four. Did you have any? Did you want to offer any thoughts up on things you recall or things that stuck out to you from last week or last week? How you exapted any of it, or if not, how you want to engage with the second half of chapter four.
Nothing immediately comes to mind.
Okay.
Exapted or taken from it this time, but I had a lot of trouble understanding. Not a lot of trouble, but understanding what exactly is going on with justice in the second half of part 4. So I want to see if we can pick it apart.
Casey's on my side. Good. I'm happy to hear that, Casey. I really struggled with the second half. So yeah.
All right, so we'll get started then. I will go through the remainder of the notes I had from last week over the three virtues, and then beyond that, I'm not super well prepared. So, but just breadth, get to be the breadth first overview. They talk about, they establish a methodology where they say, okay, we're going to introduce 3 virtues, which is wisdom, courage, and temperance, aka moderation. And then after that, we're going to go search for justice. Once we talk about those 3 legs, we'll see if that colors anything. Once we do that, they say, oh, whoops, our methodology didn't work. It was broken. We got to figure out what else to do. Then they kind of talk about desire for a bit, and they kind of talk about their method, and they adjust the method a little bit in some ways I didn't quite understand. Then finally, at the end of the chapter, they basically have, okay, we have our first kind of proposal for a definition, they kind of put the idea of justice explicitly on the table for the first time, which I haven't really, I'm unprepared to unpack that or get into that. So hopefully we'll do that well as a group. All right, so let's kind of roll back to the 3 virtues. We didn't go through this too much, but I'll just kind of start to resume where we left off. So wisdom is this idea of it needs knowledge, but not the kind of knowledge of a good carpenter. If you have
Episteme.
Okay, episteme. And they propose that wisdom is exemplified by the perfect guardian, which is the guardians, which is the smallest class. And they say that it's the kind of knowledge which resides in presiding and ruling over a part of oneself. So they seem to be establishing that self-mastery is an integral part of, or maybe a prerequisite to something like that, to wisdom.
They're the ones exercising judgment, it seems.
Yeah, the guardians would have to, right? They'd have to be the ones.
It's interesting. There's only one. Judgment is reserved for the one class and with the least amount of people in it. The top of the triangle, I guess you'd say.
That's not surprising. That's how it has to work, right? Like you can't have everybody in charge. So
yeah, it reminds me of so throughout my job, I show up, you're interacting with customers and stuff, and they want to know a bunch of things about what you're doing, and why was my delivery late or something like that, and they want to know where were you before this. And it's like, I thought that's information that I'm not going to give to you because you're not equipped to make a good judgment, because they don't have awareness of the whole situation. They're not taking into consideration the whole job, whatever, blah blah blah. I'm sure it's a lot worse with if you're a doctor or a contractor or something like that, and the homeowner's wife is in there over your shoulder. It's like, what are you doing there? It's like, listen, like this, you're not a contractor. You're not in a position to make judgments on these things. You don't exactly know what I'm doing. You don't have the perspective that I have.
yeah, and especially with like deliveries, like what came before is too small a piece to worry about in some sense, right? Because you
It's
need
like
the whole path.
it doesn't concern you. It's not that it's like I'm trying to keep something secret. It's like this information isn't going to help you make a judgment because you can't make a judgment on this.
Right.
So the idea that you just mentioned is that the guardians exercise justice. This is sort of, I wonder what kind of concept the Greeks had for this idea of motivation. It's like, let's suppose you're white, you've been instructed properly such that you know what justice is and you can discern properly. Like, okay, I know the state's headed in this direction, or I know I need to do this thing. Did they not have this concept of there's Augustine for sure. Yeah, like Augustine, like I do the things I hate. Did they not ever introduce this idea of cognitive dissonance, or this idea of my heart?
Passion.
Yeah, the passion. Okay.
It's all passions.
It's all passions.
It's all passions. Yeah, we're ruled by the passions in the ancient Greek thought, and we can manage the passions to some extent, and it's all passion. That's what's actually driving people is passion.
He goes into a much deeper allegory of that later in the Republic, I think. Like the man, the lion, and the beast. That's much. I don't know if that's in the Republic or if it's in
the tripartite. I think it is in the Republic.
He goes sort of into
tripartite's
it
right here. I don't know if he
makes that analogy though.
I don't know if that analogy is in this book, but the tripartite is definitely here.
Tripartite is in the book. Yeah, I don't know about was it the lion, the man, the monster, or whatever? Yeah, I don't know about that. Vicky talked a lot about that though.
Yeah. So after wisdom, we have courage.
So I just wanted to note one thing that I think is important. They mention on wisdom that the difference between the wisdom of the guardians is that it's ordained by the law, as opposed to the barbarian or something like, or the brute or something like that, where they can kind of act in a way that's similar to the guardians, but it's not ordained by the law.
What's the word for law there then? Because
Let me see.
We know.
this is right. We're always confusing law of man with law of God in modern times, we'll say, and that's a problem because the ancient Greeks didn't think of it that way.
A natural law.
Right. They have a differentiation between now. Well, and some people make 3 differentiations. But
Okay,
whatever,
I'm sorry.
doesn't matter.
They mention this on courage, but I agree. For I suppose that you mean to exclude the mere uninstructed courage, such as that of a wild beast or a slave. This is, in your opinion, is not the courage which the law ordains, and ought to have another name.
I think it's probably closer to natural. I looked up the word that was being used, lawlessness, and that was paranomia, which is translated in I can't remember which Bible as iniquity, and I think even translated as transgression in a Bible translation. So it's a type of moral transgression. So I would have imagined that would be the same thing here. Oh, by the way, okay, right here. Let's see. Then, is there some knowledge possessed by some of the citizens in the city we just founded that doesn't judge about any particular matter, but about the city as a whole and the maintenance of good relations, both internally and with other cities? There you go. Good relations. So we could spend some time on that. What's a good relation? Maybe not. I mean,
Was that related to courage, or was that?
Well, I think good in the like. I think it's just it's just a passing good relations. We're going to get deeper into goodness later on. Once we get deeper into goodness, we could flip back to this and talk about good relations. But, anyways, I put a pin in it.
So that's a good question. Like maybe first we could ask how did the text describe courage? I'm not sure I actually have an explicit definition in my notes, but one thing that jumped out to me in my mind, it's like courage is like the thing that you're compelled to do, you'd die for. And so let me read this passage. Of the opinion respecting things to be feared, what are they and by what nature, which the law implants through education? And I mean by the words under all circumstances, to intimate that in pleasure or in pain, or under the influence of desire or fear, a man preserves, and does not lose this opinion. Shall I give you an illustration? I think that they're basically trying to define courage as that thing that you stick when you stick to your guns, that thing underneath that, I think, is what they're saying courage is. And they give some illustration. And so I guess what's the difference between somebody who sticks to their guns and doesn't have a right relationship with something, though? I mean, I don't know, but that's
the foolishness. Right. So like the slave or the brute or whatever is foolish if they're sticking to something that's, say, not a principle or something they can't properly embody or whatever.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. Preservation of the belief has been inculcated by the law through education about what things and sorts of things are to be feared. So if you think of like, if you think, like honor your mother and father, when part of you wants to think that, oh, my mother or father's behaving inappropriate, or not, I'm not even going to say that, is annoying me or making me upset, having courage and remembering that law of to honor them, and that you honor them irregardless of anything else. So, something like that. Like, I know my mom is really upsetting me right now, but nonetheless, it's the law, and I must adhere to the law to honor her, regardless of her annoying me or doing something stupid or whatever. It almost a sense to look past the thing in you that's trying to identify her as doing something stupid, in favor of honoring her. That's what I'm thinking, what I get from this. That courage to adhere to the law.
Yeah, that idea of courage is preservation of belief I find interesting. One time when I was in college, I heard a good definition for anger in a Bible study once at a Presbyterian church. They said anger is when they're talking about Jesus, overturning the tables in the market because they're desacralizing the temple by turning it into a marketplace, taking something that's sacred and doing,
That's our
I heard
here.
anger is energy expressed in defense of something. And I remember I heard the definition, and it kind of stuck with me for life. But I've always conceptualized anger because it could be good or bad. Like it's like that fuel where it's like, oh man, I need to defend. We need to defend. So that's interesting. I've never thought of courage in a similar way of preserving a belief. But I'll have to play with that. So I mean, I don't know. Does that mean anger is connected to courage in some way? I don't know.
I think we can definitely at least say this: anger is wielded by courage. In fact, they actually get into anger later in the book. They get into anger later on, how it can be wielded by. I think they say that anger is actually associated. I think you're right. I think if I remember correctly, they associate anger with the middle part of the soul, which is, and they say that it can succumb to the bottom part, the passions, and it can also succumb to the top part. And I think what they resolve on is that it ultimately is the servant of the top part, for the sake of the whole. We'll have to remember this when we get into that section of this book, though.
One thing that did stick out to me on courage is they said it's a kind of salvation, and they said like about the nature of things to be feared and not feared. So like, right? It's like there's that they introduce that fear element again. But I didn't really know what to make of the whole concept of it. It's a kind of salvation. I mean, they're using very extreme language.
Can we think of it? Can we think of like?
Well, they're speaking of these very heavy eternal, like is a kind of thing. It's like if you have a heavy eternal way of looking at things, it's gonna cause you to look at things differently, right? Like,
yeah, but I mean, we talked about the extreme absurdism in the book, right, where they're totalizing everything and universalizing everything, and like if we have one good man, it must be so, right? He must be perfect.
Well, the implication is that in order to be courageous, you have to have an eternal lens. If courage is salvation of what ought to be feared, then you can't be courageous without having that on your mind. You have to be thinking about this thing should make you fearful. Otherwise, how can you be courageous? That's how I'm reading the text, right?
I would say that's true for all the virtues.
That's why they say it's through good education and physical training to know the correct things.
Well, let's think about maybe this will help. Let's think about this class. This is going to be the warrior class, and what does the warrior class do? They go out and they preserve the identity of the city, and to their death, right? So they're completely staking their life on the preservation of the identity of the city. That's why they're warriors.
Yeah, that relationship to the cities, I think, is important. It's not so that they can get a good payday because they won the battle. They're not mercenaries. It's not a relationship of a mercenary. It's a.
It's interestingly on that. I think that the lower class, if that's what we want to call it, the bottom class, the one at the bottom, the merchants and the laborers, That's actually where all of the wealth is held in this just city. The upper two classes don't possess any wealth. All the money is in the lower class. I'm not sure how much money, but the wealth of the city, in so much that it has wealth, is held by the lower class.
They talked about the difference between those other cities that are not perfect have the problem of, well, they're divided into the rich that are going to war against the poor. In this model, what is it kind of is the wealth is relatively uniform, I guess. I don't know if they mentioned it, but is that the idea? Is there more of a stronger equivalence among people? At least some
That's
In
what
regards to what?
That's how they start the book. Is book 4, isn't it?
Yeah.
Okay, I just didn't remember. Okay.
Yeah,
well,
the city
it
really
is a little
belongs
later
to the
that
Guardians, yet they derive no good from it. It's the argument they start. At the
Right.
beginning.
derive no good from it. Where's that?
At the very first paragraph.
At the beginning.
of book 4.
Yeah, that's the opening.
That's what Adamantius says.
They derive no good from it. Yeah, you're right. I think they're speaking relative good.
Yeah, they're talking in terms of wealth. Yeah, or
Right,
something
okay.
like that. Or
Yeah,
possessions.
right. It's just wealth. Right.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
But Socrates is like making the argument that they have to be the highest in virtue and to rule, and they have to sacrifice in terms of material goods, and wealth, and things like that in order for that to happen.
I think it's book 5. We'll get into it, but I think to even go as far as to say that the Guardians aren't even allowed to have any personal possessions, possess
But
any
that's-
material.
Yeah, but you can't equate the books, right? Because they're different cities. They're not taking book 4 and adding to it. They're starting over again in each book.
Well, what makes
They're
you say
really
that?
postulating, because that's the whole format of the book, is they just keep postulating new versions of city.
Okay, well,
Over and
I can
over.
see that.
Yeah, so it's not like they're taking, because Danny mentioned this earlier, right? Like, it's not like they're taking this, they destroyed it. They said, oh no, this didn't work, we got to start over.
Yeah,
That's what they do. They keep
Socrates, I think
starting
he
over.
says somewhere near the end of book 4, it's like, well, if there's one thing wrong with their conception of justice, and we'll tear the whole thing down and build it anew. Something
Right,
like that.
and then they keep doing that over and over again. That's kind of the format of the whole book.
Mhm. Well, at the end of book 4, he's like, okay, let's move on to what bad cities look like. That's actually the beginning of book 5.
Yeah,
Take a little detour.
That's at the end of book 4.
Oh, is it? Oh, yeah. But at the beginning of book 5, they're like, wait, hold on a second. Let's take a little detour. Okay. So anything else on courage?
Yeah, so I mean, well, they give. I noticed that the connection between there's an influence of desire or fear to courage, which I again I don't really know what to make of it, but they keep bringing that up. If you think about courage as being a thing that is the function of courage is to defend this in the Guardians is to defend the identity of the city, then I'm just thinking like, why is that not the case of the husbandman? You know, like the husbandman, I guess his mind is not really there. I guess his mind is like, it's kind of like maybe like a more, I mean, like why is the carpenter, why is the carpenter not burdened with this? I guess what need for courage, or what is it, or just a lack of? Is he just a less courageous person? Like they do go on to say. Well, first, I don't know if we want to pause because later they get into the purple analogy. Which let's go through this first because I don't know how it's relevant, but it might be relevant. But they said when dyeing a garment purple, which they're saying is an illustration for courage, you have to start with pure white. If you don't start with pure white, there's a solvency to taking on the dye, and I don't know if that solvency of like, what does it mean for a guardian to be pure starting or a person to be pure white, and then what does it mean for the solvency of or the stick-to-itiveness for courage to stick when there's the appropriate fear or desire. I don't know exactly, but that's kind of what I heard in the purple.
They're illustrating the principle that you can't just take purple and apply it to anything and get purple. And there's two reasons for that. Like one is
Yeah.
the blending of colors as such, which is, the understated. And the other reason is because not everything can accept the dye. And so so let's suppose you had a justice. Like let's just suppose you had a justice or some justice paint or something, right? You can't just hand that off or slaver it over something and get a just thing. That's the analogy, and that's correct, at least according to the outline that they have here.
Mm-hmm.
Right. But courage is really the the uh, the what would you call it? The override of your desire for the things that you have to keep some principle in place. Right? The courageous man is willing to risk his life, right, for whatever principle it is. And so it's really about sacrifice. Right. It's about, yeah, you've got all these desires, like the desire to live or the desire not to have conflict or whatever, but you're willing to throw all that aside to make sure this thing that's bigger than you is protected.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'm kind of going off into outer space here, but I like when you said you can't just put justice paint anywhere. I'm thinking about like, okay, well, if I'm gonna paint a couple layers of primer, that sounds very like, I don't know, repentance or like submission or like what is it to paint on a layer of primer in your life? I don't know. I don't know if they mentioned that at all.
It is to sacrifice something you have today, right, to prepare the surface, prepare the way for tomorrow. And that might be meditation, it might be prayer, that there's, I guess the Christian argument would be, yeah, that's Christianity, right? It's preparing you the way for the eternal dance or whatever, right?
Kenosis, emptying.
Yeah,
something like that.
There's some stuff here. Okay. And pleasure is much more potent than any powder, washing soda, or soap. Okay, I found the spot that you're talking about. The power to preserve through everything the correct and law-inculcated belief about what is to be feared and what isn't is what I call courage, unless of course you say otherwise. So yeah, the appetites are the most potent in the ability to guard against those. Something else worth noting here. It says, then I accept your account of courage. Accept it instead as my account of civic courage, and you will be right. We'll discuss courage more fully some other time if you like. At present, our inquiry concerns not it, but justice. And what we've said is sufficient for that purpose. So there's a little there. I'm not sure if they come back to courage in the Republic or civic courage. By the way, there was another disclaimer at the end of wisdom. I noticed right before courage, he says, then we found one of the four virtues as well as its place in the city, though I don't know how we found it. I think it's interesting that he puts those little disclaimers there, not to be an absolute, not to claim absolute knowledge on it.
Yeah, that is interesting.
Yeah, even their methodology itself just sounded like they were describing some ambiguous circumambulation. When they say, okay, well, you can start by talking about the thing itself and then talk about things around it, or you can talk about things around it and then hopefully you get to the thing itself, right? And then they go on to say, oh, our method actually was wrong. After they go through the three virtues, they say that somewhere. I don't remember. I didn't write it down, but they get to the point where they're like, oh, the whoops, like we got to come up with a different method because this didn't work. But
yeah.
Right.
But it's so like you mentioned, like where are they standing though? You keep saying that, Ethan. Like, how are they able to see these things? Where's the monotheism coming from? Or when they say this, whenever they say an ought, like what are they standing on when they give an ought? Or it's a good question. I don't know.
I mean, to the people that were reading this, maybe it would have been a little more obvious than the people reading this were reading it. But like, the Greeks back in the day, obvious to them that we're a little bit closer to the culture that this came out of, but to us moderns, maybe not so much. There is another disclaimer. This one's for John Vervaeke, and there's a disclaimer about the limits of dialogue, which I thought is interesting. I'll bring it up when we get to it.
Yeah, and I think that's really the crux of things is the fact that in ancient Greece they were all polytheists. Like there aren't that the all the axiomatic assumptions that philosophy is based on to the ancient Greeks are assumptions that come from their religious practice. And that's very much things like the Republic are very much a struggle with that dichotomy between our assumptions from our practices, right? And again, it's right in the beginning of the book. What is the framing for the book? The framing for the book is a celebration of some polytheistic crazy goddess or something. And
Thracian
everything
goddess.
proceeds from there. It's not hidden. It's not accidental. It's not entertainment. They're being explicit about something very, very,
Yeah,
very important.
it's
And yeah, we
definitely not
don't
hidden
have
in
that, to your point, Ethan. We don't have that framing.
something that we're missing. Well, because you can't really, you can point at it and hint at it, in the text, but you ultimately can't write down. You can't explicate framing. Like you can't explicate context. I mean, there's certain things, but you can never wholly contain context within text. By the way, there's another reminder of that coming up here when we get to justice. We talked about it last week. Hunters, using the hunting analogy. So, is there anything else here on courage? Should we remember that this is the account of civic courage? And again, reminding ourselves that this is kind of a holistic view of the polis. So,
Right.
the spirit of courage is going to be more embodied by this class of people.
What do you mean by holistic view of the polis? What does the polis mean?
Polis is just the city,
Just, okay.
whatever.
The people,
Okay.
yeah, the group of
Okay.
people that are grouped.
Yeah, I
Okay,
guess
let me.
I tend to
Didn't he get?
go ahead. I'm just
Didn't he get hung up on the word city? Are we not even supposed to? I can't remember. Are we supposed to call this a city or not supposed to call it a city?
It's a polis, technically, I think. Yeah, I think.
Because remember, I
city's the
got hung
modern
up on that
translation.
word. Anyways, go ahead, Danny.
I was just I guess in my mind I tend to think much more that the concept trying to apply the concept of courage to the individual, like it's commentary on the soul. Now, if it is civic courage, like if it is the case that we're defining civic courage, I think if they're defining it for the purpose of applying it to the individual, not for the purpose of having it function in some political frame. Right?
Yeah. Well, the thing is, we're kind of we're projecting this on a polis so that we can get a better idea of these spirits, these virtues, courage and whatnot, and these virtues exist independently of any individual. They don't come from the individual. They're things that the individuals adhere to. So whether it's big on the scale of a city or small on the scale of an individual, nonetheless, it's still the same thing. But later on in the book, they'll condense it. If that's the right word, or contract it down to these four virtues to the individual. They actually do that at the end of the book here.
Well, what's interesting, what I mean by that is like when they mention courage, the first exemplification of that, they say, here it is right here. Why I say everyone who calls any state courageous or cowardly will be thinking of the part which fights and goes out to war on the state's behalf, right? Like, ideally, if we were in this ideal utopia, there wouldn't be war amongst states, right? Maybe, maybe, right? If we were only concerned with like holding hands and singing Kumbaya in our philosophy, we wouldn't make that our first move in defining our term, but they do, right? Which right is, and therefore, like, what I take away from that is that there's something about that aggression that is an important aspect of courage in the individual. That's kind of how I read that. Does that make sense what I'm saying? I'm talking about the way that they introduce the concepts. I don't think that they're like I don't know if they're saying like literally effect in fighting is the thing that we're trying to optimize for when we introduce the idea of courage. Like courage is the thing that the guy who's the best at fighting, that's the most courageous guy. I don't like that's what they said, but I don't think that's what they're getting at. You know, right?
Yeah, I would get hung up on it. I mean, you could. It's. Think of what it's analogous
Where
with.
did they say that again?
What about
They say-
war?
Just who in calling the city cowardly or courageous would look anywhere other than to the part of it that fights and does battle on its behalf.
That's a different statement. What number is that in the?
I don't have the numbers. It's like a
Or
third
something.
What are
way.
you looking for, Mark? Is that what you're looking for?
429B, I think.
Yeah, that's 429B.
Well, I'm just trying to. I need to contrast with my translation here. Let's.
So I just think it's a funny way that they bring about the concept of courage, right? Because anyway, so I guess like in my mind, I would only do that if I would only introduce the concept in that way if I thought that there was some kind of facet of aggression that's important, right? So that's I guess that's the way that my mind reads this text.
A facet of aggression that's important.
Undergirding the courage, like the concept of courage.
He's saying like from the outside, you know,
like
if your carpenters were courageous, like, you wouldn't call the whole city courageous.
Is not peacetime ideal? Like, is not the ideal state at peace because it has alliances, like they already mentioned? They said like.
Well, the thing is, there's no such thing as peace. Ultimately, I mean, if you think about it, I mean, they don't have this here, but in a fallen world, there's always going to be something. Like, for example, like, you know, one thing that comes to mind is, so remember that a couple months ago there was that hockey player. I think he was a Russian Orthodox or something, and he's like, I'm not. They wanted the team to go out there and do a warm up for trans rights or something like that, and he's like, I'm not going to do that. That goes against my principles. Like, that's the type of, I think that's the type of courage, or that's the same courage that we're talking about here, is preserving those higher laws, calling out evil. Like, it, you know, that's something that we say a lot here. You know, first of all, when you're calling out evil, forgive this word, it's relative to the higher principle, to a higher principle that you are adhering to. So it's like, that is bad and it needs to stop, or I need to keep it out of here, you know,
and it's a potential sacrifice. Like, and that's what makes it courageous. Like, the man who loses nothing by speaking up is not courageous.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly.
It's just not. There has to be an element of the potential of risk, of the potential for loss. Courageous. I don't see this. Yeah, what you read is not in my translation, that's for sure. Here relating, you know, their ability to fight with courage.
It's okay. Right after that, they say then courage is a kind of salvation. Salvation of what? Of the opinion respecting things to be feared, what they are, and of what nature, which the law implants through education, and they go on. And I mean, I already read, and I mean by the words, under all circumstances to intimate and pleasure and play and blah blah. You stick to your guns, no matter what, right? There's that stick to itiveness, that resolve, and they're describing that as a kind of salvation. So, I mean, yeah, neither here. I guess our starting point doesn't really matter, but
my translation says preservation. Of salvation, yes. I think.
Right.
Could you think of it this way, as like you have, you know, we see a lot of TV shows and stuff with that take place in medieval monarchies and whatnot. Like, someone important, they have a bodyguard, right? And the purpose of the bodyguard is to preserve the royalty or the important person. I'm wondering if you could think of it that way. Preserving the higher thing.
Yeah, well, they swear fealty, right? And they're gonna fight no matter what, and yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I remember last one I watched was the new Game of Thrones. And there's they have some really interesting themes in that show, because you have two different people, that these two whatever we'll call them warriors are sworn to, right? And it's some really interesting themes because the people that they're sworn to, their actual principles, or what they represent, may or may not be questionable. But what is not questionable is that their subordinate warriors, they are 100% embodying this virtue of courage, and they're like, it doesn't matter to me what the person, it doesn't matter to me what my master is, if they're a good or a bad person. I'm still committed. What I'm committed to is my virtue, which is courage, and I'm going to defend them to the death. That's my purpose and my role. And these two guys go out and they'll fight each other, irregardless of what the higher principle that they're serving is, because it's not really their concern.
They're not arrogant enough to believe that they can make the determination.
Exactly.
This is where it becomes difficult for people. Looking
Yes.
down, looking up from being down at the level of the person, you can't tell the good from the bad. But we always look at stories as we know which is good and which is bad. And then we infer a character behavior from that. But that's all hindsight bias. Like the good
Yeah.
king is good until he goes bad. Right? That's like, this is the deep confusion over Hitler. Hitler saved Germany. He saved lives. And then it's like, well, why did people follow Hitler? Well, because he saved Germany. It's not like, he was, talking about concentration camps and genocide. That's not what happened. And so you don't understand. Hitler did lots of good things until he turned bad and did lots of bad things. And the people at the bottom couldn't measure that, or couldn't measure it,
Right.
on
They're not capable. They're not capable of exercising judgment. They can't.
or
It's
they,
not their.
or they might be capable, but they have other things to do. And look, you don't have time to exercise judgment on Danny's coding when you're busy with a family raising kids.
That's right.
Even if you could do it,
Nothing to see here.
even if you could, no, you've got priorities. You can't do all things all the time, and you can't measure the goodness or badness of every individual's behavior at all times. You can't do that.
Let me jump ahead real quick. Then it turns out that this doing one's own work, provided that it comes to be in a certain way, is justice. So that's what we're talking about. The people at the bottom, that it's not their, we'll just say their expertise or their obligation isn't in judging. That's in our, what do we call, our first class.
Right, but you don't
embody wisdom.
You don't want to get caught up in the fact that you can do something.
Of course, we're we're totalizing things here for the sake of argument.
Right, but yeah, I want to pick that apart too and say, just because you can do a thing doesn't mean you have the authority or that you should do a thing.
Yes.
Because there are priorities. And so the fact that you can judge good and bad, say, in every person, even if that were a possible thing that you could do, doesn't mean that you're obligated to, and it doesn't mean you're authorized to, and it doesn't mean that you should do it. And that's where people get confused in recent times. They keep saying, no, you're capable of this, and therefore you're responsible for doing it. And it's like, no, I'm not responsible for doing everything I'm capable of. That's not possible. You can't do everything you're capable of. That doesn't make any sense. Time is a constraint. Energy is a constraint. Focus is a constraint, right? Your attention. These are all constraints. And you're constantly trading off and making prioritizations. And one of the nice things about the city is that or the polis in this case, it's giving you the prioritization based on class. That's what they're doing. They're saying, yeah, you're at the bottom. You just follow, man. You're not supposed to be judging good and evil in the king. Fair enough.
Yeah, exactly. That's, again, that's what I really appreciated about that Game of Thrones. Is like you have two guys that are fully embodying their virtue that they're obligated to, regardless of what their master is above, if their master above is good or bad. That was actually really neat to see.
It's important
because it just really throws people off. and which we live, where everything's flat and everybody embodies every virtue 100%. You know, no separation.
Yeah, I think that's
Danny,
a good insight. Yeah, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, is there anything else here on courage?
No, I didn't have anything on courage. I was going to move into temperance, but I did just want to. It sounds elementary, like a basic observation that like capability should not be equated with responsibility. Just because you can do something, you shouldn't. That sounds very trivial, but it's something that like in our culture, when you think of like self-help, it's like American self-help is like the opposite of that. It's like, you know, you got a 100% gas pedal. That you can really hurt yourself. I mean, I've done this so physically. I physically hurt my back in the gym once. I was deadlifting like, I don't know, 650 pounds or something really heavy. I was like, I was listening to this motivational speaker. I recall as I got injured, listening to this, like only those, yeah, this was the lyrics of whatever. Only those who can, basically like who risk going too far can possibly find out how far one can go, and then snap, right? That's how you hurt, you know, and you could do that. That's literally, now it was physical, right? But metaphorically, you can mess yourself up if you go 100%. Your mind will mess you up, you know.
Yeah, the self-help culture and we'll say the United States, I guess, has the potential to be incredibly damaging to not only the person but the people around them, because it doesn't take into account any of these things that we're talking about, virtue or higher goods, or it's just like pick one thing and one thing. Well, they don't tell you how to pick the thing that you're going to work
No,
towards,
but also
or if that
it
thing is
doesn't
good or
account
not.
for aptitude. Like they're saying you can do something without knowing you. Can you do that? I don't know. Like, probably not. Most people can't do most things. So the assumption that like, oh, you know what you can do? You can just resolve your own trauma. That's almost certainly false, like on its face. But like, are the skills that you're referencing in your stupid self-help book available? You know, like maybe they're not. Like that's what I like about pragmatic people like Peterson, right? He's just giving you these pragmatic things that anybody can do, right? That don't require specialized skills or specialized understanding, and the whole trick to those self-help books, if there is a trick, and you know, there's certainly a trick in some of them, is that they give you the framing and then tell you can implement it. So they're kind of handing you the whole thing and telling you that you're doing it. It's like, no. The book is giving you all this stuff. You're not doing that. The book is providing you the ability to try it. But that doesn't mean that you have all the other skills required to implement correctly.
Right. So
And
yeah,
you can tell me all about how I can deadlift 600 pounds, but I can't deadlift 600 pounds. Like it's the physicality of it isn't going to work out, right? But the technicality can. And that they're giving you the technicality, the techne, without knowing you. And maybe that techne is not something you can use. And it's going to, which is the opening of the book, right? Is forbidden knowledge is real and it's important. Doing something that you cannot do, you will damage yourself. If you have knowledge that, yeah, you have to break the boundaries, you can break your back and be permanently disabled. Are you sure that's the right tactic? Do you have to know those boundaries? Can't you just assume they're there and stay as far away as possible? Because that's a better tactic for some things, not all things, but some things.
Yeah.
so yes, important to acknowledge trade-offs of your choices. No, I got nothing else on courage. If anybody
So
else has anything, I'm just gonna move to temperance.
Wisdom, which is judgment, regarding good things and good relations. So the higher, the king or whatever. Courage is preservation, and the dying is a great analogy there, or a great symbol for us to appreciate that. Making sure that it's dyed properly to where it's going to resist all of these other things, these other soda, powder, pleasure, appetites. Now moving on to moderation, which seems to be the one that Socrates is the most uncomfortable with. And we can talk, they're just having a very hard time talking about it. And I think I have an idea why, is because as you get further and further away from the triangle down towards the bottom, things become, like we were just saying earlier, it's very difficult to, you can't get context, and we're getting further and further away from the point. Things at the point are very easy to see and articulate and explicate, but the further away you get from that, the more implicit it becomes. So something like moderation is difficult to talk about because it's a peripheral thing. In fact, he even says that temperance is kind of exists everywhere. I don't know. What does he say here? Exists. Unlike courage and wisdom, each of which resides in one part, making the city brave and wise respectively, moderation spreads throughout the whole, and makes the weakest, the strongest, and those in between, whether in regard to reason, physical strength, numbers, wealth, or anything else, all sing the same song together. And this unanimity, this agreement between the naturally worse and the naturally better, is to which of the two is to rule both in the city, and each one is rightly called moderation. So is this what you were talking about, Mark, where well, just because you can see something doesn't necessarily mean it's appropriate for you to be taking on that role?
Right. Or even just because you know something.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So early in my career, I worked for a company, did some groundbreaking stuff. It wasn't AI, but it didn't need to be. It was better than AI, actually. It was very math based. And what happened was they had made a mistake in their SQL query, and I was never, still am not the best database guy in the world, never was, but I knew what they had done. I was like, oh, I know exactly what you're doing. Effectively you're scanning the tables in the wrong order, right? I'm not their top database guy. Their top database guy, was a decent database person, and he didn't see it as a problem, right? When I tried to bring it up as an issue, it wasn't my place, and yeah, that did not go well. I made a lot of enemies, and that's the problem. Is that sometimes you have to live with a problem because you're not even though you're right about it, you're not the expert, you're not the authority, and all you can do is stir up trouble and piss people off rather than just deal with the thing that is not, it wasn't that big a deal at the end of the day. I mean, it eventually might have gotten fixed had I not pushed the issue, and then I, probably have and stayed there longer. I was a contractor, but yeah, I mean that's the problem, is that when you bring stuff out, even if you're right, that's being right doesn't, it's not, it doesn't say, and often those consequences are more than you can bear, and so the consequence of putting up with the thing that you know is wrong less than the consequence of making enemies, because often it is.
Kind of reminds me of an interaction I had with my boss yesterday at work. If it seems fitting, I'll bring it up. Another thing here, I don't know just what they mean by them, but they are, so to speak, like tracks. Okay, moderation is surely a kind of order, the mastery of certain kinds of pleasures and desires.
Mm-hmm.
People indicate as much when they use the phrase self-control and other similar phrases. I don't know just what they mean by them, but they are, so to speak, like tracks or clues that moderation has left behind in language. Isn't that so? I actually really appreciated that, because it's like, it's not this, but it's like they're saying, when people say self-control, it's actually a hindsight observation, a post hoc observation. I really like that he said that here. So
it's the same self that's doing the controlling and being controlled. So it's like, that doesn't make any sense.
Yeah,
To say self-control, but it's sort of there's something. It's like hinting at it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly. It's a silly self-reference. If you had control of yourself, why would you need to exert self-control? Wait a minute. What's more controlling And how
It's
are
a-
you doing it if you didn't already have control? And yeah, it gets very circular. But there's
That's literally
something
what they
to it.
say next, or in the next paragraph is what you just said, Mark. It's like, what isn't self-control ridiculous? The stronger self that does the controlling is the same as the weaker self that gets controlled, so that only one person is referred to in all such expressions. Yeah, that's
Yeah,
exactly what they just said.
right, right. And yeah, I appreciate that they pointed that out too, right? But at the same point, there's something about order itself that you're conforming to. And that's what they're pointing to. It's not so much the idea of self-control is predicated on an observation outside of yourself that makes the self that validates the control, right?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Yeah, it's a very slippery thing.
Yeah, they say a better part and a worse part of oneself. And I guess they sort of differentiate that later. But like the scholastics, like Aquinas would say that it's like the will's mastery over the instincts or something like that. So which they do, they separate the tripart part, you know, the head, the heart, and the belly or whatever. Like the head is the smallest part. So temperance is like all three parts in harmony.
Yeah, Mark, you're just reciting the book here. You got an incredible ability to retain things. The expression is nonetheless, the expression is apparently trying to indicate that in the soul of the very person, there is a better part and a worse part, and one that, whenever the naturally better part is in control of the worse, this is expressed by saying that the person is self-controlled or master of himself. At any rate, one praises someone by calling him self-controlled, but when, on the other hand, the smaller and better part is overpowered by the larger part because of a bad upbringing or bad company, this is called being self-defeated or licentiousness and its reproach. So, like, in control in regards to the proper appropriation or proper ordination to proper hierarchy, I guess. Well, yeah, I think so.
Yeah, that's the order.
Yeah,
Part of
order.
order is hierarchy. Like you can't do ordering without hierarchy because you have to
Proper,
have
yeah,
priority and
yeah,
sequence. And
ordination.
so there's always
Proper
a first.
ordination.
Something is better and something is worse. Always.
Right.
Mm-hmm. Everything in its order. Yeah, they're really. What does he say? Is there a way we could find justice so as not to have to bother with moderation any further? That's at the very beginning, right after they finished courage.
Can we not talk about it? Is what Socrates is saying.
Yeah.
Yeah, because it doesn't have a reference. Moderation.
Mm-hmm.
How are you measuring moderate terms? That's why they don't want to deal with it. And it's still very much the mission of philosophy to sort of, to some extent, differentiate and throw off the yoke of any particular polytheistic belief. Not religion as such, just the fact that we're dealing with all these crazy religions, and what do we do?
All right. I've got to take a break. I'll come back if I can. My contractor's here, so.
Okay.
Hey, sir.
Yeah.
Hope
Good to see you,
you
man.
back soon.
Hope to see you back. Yeah, what Ethan brought up, I thought that was interesting. He like his triangle analogy, the idea that temperance is this thing on the periphery. And therefore it's kind of more difficult to talk about. I thought that was an interesting kind of way of putting it. The way the text said, the language of the text said that temperance has more the nature of harmony and symphony, right? And then it's the ordering or the controlling of pleasures and desires. We touched on both of those two things. Or in other words, you have these competing principles, and when the better is under control, we call that mastery of self. Otherwise, it's called unprincipled. We touched on all those things. They adapt that concept up to the state, and they say, therefore, the state must justly be called master of itself if the words temperate and self-mastery truly express the rule of the better part over the worse. So basically just taking the same frame and thinking about how can I apply this to a state. And it's and one thing I think is interesting, I guess maybe the reason it's hard to talk about is because if it is temperance is on the whole, you have to talk about it in terms of superiority and inferiority of things. And you kind of, I guess you just start at the daemon. You must have to just start at the daemon or something like that in order to discuss such things. But the link that I just noticed was that, man, what was the last thing you said? Self-control. Oh, I'm sorry, man. Oh, basically, Socrates is finding it hard to talk about. After they talk about the virtues and they put the first definition of justice on the table, they talk about like the correlativity of terms, like thirst, and how there's lots of words, bigger, smaller. Like there's lots of words that are relative, or relative. Like you define the word by looking at the correlates. Like what does it correlate to? So I think maybe they're putting temperance is like maybe the first time we're seeing this tool on the table, or at least it's explicit to me. What do you guys think about that? Like they're introducing the concept of relativity for the first time, or they're pointing to an element of relativity for the first time. Is that significant at all?
Is that the first time? I don't know if that's the first time. It might be. I don't know if it's significant. I mean,
I don't know, because they go on to talk about desire.
It's all contrast, right? Yeah. They're using relativity throughout with the contrast. So I don't think it's the first time. It might be the first time they're pointing to a specific type of relativity. Where are you in the text, Jenny?
Oh, I'm all over the place. I need to get a PDF that actually has markers on it. So I didn't really get to the last 25% super deeply.
Yeah,
but
the PDF that you pointed to has the markers.
I'm in a bunch. Long story short, the PDF that I'm using right now doesn't have the markers. I need to get one that does. But
how is that? Are you sure they're not at the top of the page in brackets?
No, not in this PDF. So anyway, we can at the end of temperance. What happens after that? Does somebody else maybe want to? What happens after they stop talking about temperance? Might be better to get somebody else's take on this.
After temperance is their analogy of like hunters, like surrounding the prey. It's like we've got our three virtues here, and then justice is somewhere in the weeds around them.
Mm-hmm.
Right. They say if we solve these three, the missing component is justice, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then Socrates kind of makes his like imperfect definition of justice being each one doing their own.
Yeah, and the language is sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say the language is kind of funny. They're like, all right, we've set the stage. We're ready to go find justice. Now pay attention. If you see it, if you see it, let us know. All right. It's just kind of funny. Like they're going on a safari and, there it is. There's justice. It just jumped out. But ultimately I think they define justice as, in my mind, I don't have any notes on this, but basically like doing what you ought to be doing. Like doing your role or something like that. I don't know if that's very sloppy. I don't know if that's exactly what they said. Maybe it's submitting to the polis or the something like, I don't know. What do you guys think? What did they propose that justice was?
It's like we stated, often repeated, that everyone must practice one of the occupations in the city for which he is naturally best suited. Like when Socrates is talking about how he'd been talking about it the whole time.
Mm-hmm.
Right? It's doing one's own work is justice.
That's right.
It's like, well, what are you talking about? I think he's talking to Glaucon in this, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
Glaucon says he's not certain what he's talking about.
Yeah, I recall that being a key point that they made. And then I also recall them saying our method was wrong. And I recall them mentioning, hey, remember when we said everybody should only do one thing? Was maybe there was a problem with that? They brought that up. They said, hey, remember how when we started talking, we said everybody should do one thing? I think they might have made a point off of that observation somehow, but I don't recall. This is a problem when we lose Ethan, and my preparation was didn't go to the end. And then from what I recall from listening, just from memory, they introduced like the concept of desire. I don't exactly have notes on that. And then they introduced like the theme of rational principles, and right alongside their definition of justice. So I guess question one is, what did the text define justice as? How did they propose that? If their methodology was broken, why and how? And then what did they say on desire, and what did they say about rationality? Those are kind of the four things that I recall out of the text, although my preparation is weak here, so I don't really have much commentary on it. But those are the themes that I recall being present. What do you guys think?
Yeah, I mean, they talk about desire in terms of food and thirst, right? or thirst, right? For drink alone, and hungering will be a desire for food, right? And then they kind of agree on that, right? And and then they equate that with goodness, right? Alleging no one desires a drink but good drink, nor food but good food, right? Which I would say is carrying things too far because they're using desire from a certain standpoint. But you're right; they make a relativistic claim based on that, right? Greater and lesser.
Mm-hmm. And they make some commentary on the nature of desire is that it's composed of this attraction and repulsion thing, desire and aversion. It's
I
desire.
don't see that.
Maybe I have. Would you not allow that assent and dissent, desire and aversion, attraction and repulsion are all of them opposites, whether they are regarded as active or passive? For that makes no difference in the fact of their opposition. Yes, he said they are opposites. Well, I mean, I guess that's kind of what I'm getting at. Is that like, and this is on the tail end of the temperance thing. I think, because I think what they're getting at is
Yeah, I
that
see. Yeah, I see that section. Okay, that's 437B.
that's kind of before they
Oh.
mention like, oh, you know how you can have the desire for thirst. Well, you can qualify that, and we can, but we have to stop the qualification. Otherwise, like we don't want to be computationally explosive about this.
Right. They're right. That's where they get into relativism. Relativism causes combinatorial explosion. That's what relativism combinatorial explosion, which you can't in a relativist framework. But yeah, and that was right after saying, the city. Right. And so he says you can't mix classes in the city, but also relativism. It's like, whoa, wait a minute. How are you going to resolve that now? Because you recreated that problem.
So part of the image of temperance is like, well, what if you're could there be such a circumstance where you're thirsty but yet unwilling to drink, right? This is kind of where my reading actually left off, unfortunately. But they're connecting some themes in some way that I'm not quite sure.
Yeah, they talk about striving and impelled towards, right? And then they're saying drawing back from thirst when you're from something to drink when you're hungry is an opposition of action, right? So therefore it can't be the same thing, right? So again, they're denying that paradox. They're saying, no, it can't be the same thing.
And they do get into this theme about the war between the heart and the head. And they say, and are there not many other cases in which we observe that a man's desires violently prevail over his reason? He reviles himself and is angry at the violence within him, and that in this struggle, which is like the struggle of the factions in a state, the spirit is on the side of his reason. But for the passioners, I could go on, but
Right, but he uses that argument about thirst and not being willing to drink, to separate out things and say, so we won't be irrational, right? If we claim the two are different from another, naming the part of the soul which calculates the calculating, and the other part which hungers, thirsts, is agitated by the other desires, the irrational. So he's saying there's two parts. There's the rational and the irrational part, right? And so that's his point. His point is the fact that you're thirsty doesn't lead automatically to drinking. Because there's a rational and an irrational part of your soul, and they are not always in alignment.
So I think what they're doing is they're trying to point to some kind of concept of like nobility of spirit, and they're trying to say like, hey, maybe that's what justice is. Justice is like, you've got to balance the three things, and I think that's what they're essentially trying to do.
Yeah, one who is just does not allow any part of himself to do the work of another part, or allow the various classes within him to meddle with each other. And now they're really like pulling apart their analogy of the city to like apply it to the individual, where it's justices, each of these individual parts doing what they're supposed to be doing while still working together as one.
Yeah, there was a guy who hopped on, I think it was, I watched a recap of Mark, you were on the live stream of Father Eric's live stream. Somebody talked about how like, and you said, hey, you know what, we need to stop giving single answers to questions, because this guy said, hey, like, I don't know of, I haven't studied all the different types of causes, but like I guess apparently all we ever talk about is efficient cause. But then you've got like final cause. You've got like lots of different ways to explain causality of something, right? In the same way,
about a combination of formal and efficient cause together.
Yeah.
And there's four causes, right? There's efficient, material, formal, and
final.
Yeah. Brain's like, ha! I'm gonna trip you right now. It's like, you son of a bitch, brain. my desire to whip them all out in order correctly, but the irrational part of me got the better of me there. Yeah, I mean that's important, right? Like make Final Cause great again is my little joke for that, um, which Father Eric is a big fan of. But yeah, I mean because once you put in multiple causes, everything changes, and that's sort of what they're teasing apart here. Is a lot of this is just reenchantment. It's you may think that you can boil the world down to a desire for thirst, but actually your desire to thirst doesn't necessarily lead to you drinking. And therefore, you can't simplify it down to that. So that's what this is really all about. So you can't simplify justice to this, moderation to this. You can't, right? They're saying, no, the world's really complex. And let me show you how.
Mm-hmm.
Things I've been really enjoying about the book is it does tease apart these things and say, you think it's Socratic, right? You think you know this because you use that word in a very apropos way. But in fact, if I ask you to break that down inside of a context where it matters, you can't do it because you don't know what you're talking about. And that's the whole Socratic trick in some sense, is this skeptical cynicism that, it's early postmodernism is what it really is.
So I think, yeah, it's an interesting observation. I don't have a direct response to that, but I believe, I could be wrong, but because I'm not prepared, but I think they said, hey, our tripartite of wisdom, courage, and temperance broke down somehow. And I believe they moved on to a rational versus non-rational. Say, oh, well, maybe I but my memory could be wrong. But they do get into this theme of, I'll just read this part. A further question arises. Is passion different from reason also, or only a kind of reason, in which the latter case, instead of three principles in the soul, there will only be two, the rational and the concupiscent, or rather, as the state was composed of three classes, traitors, auxiliaries, and counselors, so may there not be in the individual soul a third element, which is passion or spirit, and when not corrupted by bad education is the natural auxiliary of reason. So there's a paragraph. I don't know, maybe we've kind of covered this theme sufficiently. I don't know if you guys have any reaction to that. They kind of move in that direction.
Yeah, they definitely make the move. I'm not sure where they say this is justice and oh that didn't work, but this second half of book 4 was hard for me to follow actually.
Yeah,
there's a lot going on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's too bad that I wasn't able to speed read through it again.
You shouldn't be speed reading through this.
Well, the time I had allocated for preparation was
insufficient.
Well, it wasn't the time was insufficient. It was I did other things. I talked to people instead of doing the preparations.
Planning for
hanging out in Discord in the morning, and people joined early.
See, I saw you this morning, and I said, "Nope, gotta read."
So, yeah,
I went and read, and then I came in.
See, Manuel and we hang out in Discord and we read in silence, and I like that. But so a couple of people came by.
I would not have done that.
Yeah, I know.
I would have been like, "Hey, Danny, what's going on?" and interact. Okay, yeah.
This is exactly what happened. So, what's up? How's it going? All right, so let's see.
Oh, okay. No, they do say there's a phantom of justice. Are you still looking for justice to be something different from this power which produces such men in cities? All right, so I see what you're saying. So that's 422, 423. 442 and 443. Yeah, and they're basically making an argument about what the just man will and will not do. And they tried to reduce justice to moderation. I see. Yeah.
So they say justice, as we were describing, being concerned, however, not with the outward man, but with the inward, which is the true self of concernment of man. For the just man does not permit the several elements within him to interfere with one another, or any of them to do the work of the others. He sets in order his own inner life, and in his own master and his own law, and at peace with himself. And when he has bound together the three principles within him, which he has compared to the higher, lower, and middle notes of a scale, and the intermediate intervals, when he has bound all these together, and is no longer many, but has become one entirely temperate and perfectly adjusted nature, then he proceeds to act. If he has to act, whether this is all one sentence, by the way, whether in a manner of property or in the treatment of the body, or in some affair of politics or private business, always thinking and calling that which preserves and cooperates with this harmonious condition, just and good action. And the knowledge which, this is still the same sentence, gosh, and the knowledge which presides over it, wisdom, and that which at any time impairs this condition, he will call unjust action, and the opinion which presides over it, ignorance. Wow, that's the longest sentence I've read in a long time.
Yeah, it's broken up into several sentences in mine.
Really?
Yeah,
Interesting.
Where is that, Casey?
that would be 443D.
Oh, okay. That's where I was looking. Okay. Yeah, he's doing this run-on sentence. I'm like, that's not my book.
Yeah, it's a whole big paragraph in mine.
Yeah.
This whole paragraph.
Well, I've got D and E are the big paragraph.
Yeah, D and E is one big paragraph.
Okay.
Then right after that, it's 444. So yeah, it's not. I wouldn't say they conflate justice to moderation, because they call moderation like it's the relation of all the three parts to themselves, but justice is like each part doing its own correct thing in all circumstances.
Yeah, so moderation surely is nothing other than this in the city or in private man, right? Now, of course, a man will be just because of that which we are often saying, and in the same way, right? And then he goes and blows that argument out.
Yeah, there's a link
Oh,
for action. Just actions cause justice, and unjust actions cause injustice. So they did establish the link to behavior. And I think then they're saying it has to serve something in the way that, like, and the creation of health is the institution of a natural order in government, right? So, like, if I'm a doctor, I'm like subservient to some form of sort of order, etc. If I'm a lawyer, yada yada. So there's an element of maybe that's the logos. I don't know. Is that submission to a logos? So maybe like justice maybe needs to be submitted to a logos, and then it needs to be embodied, like you're going to die for it or something like that. And then it needs to be balanced, like the three notes of a scale, like the low, middle, and high part of a scale or something like that.
Right. Yeah, they talk about that. They talk about the high, middle, and the low.
I'm not sure that the concept of logos actually comes up in Plato. I'm not sure that comes up into like the Stoics or the Neoplatonists, right?
No, it doesn't come up except in order, which they did mention.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, the sophisticated, we'll say, Christian concept of logos is certainly not in these texts, but the idea that the combinations they're talking about are the logos is certainly in these texts. I think that's a fair interpretation.
My text uses the words natural order a lot. It also uses interesting, like, lots of math words like variance, covariance, correlative, and like they were Pythagorean, right? So they knew geometry, which is interesting.
A lot of Greek philosophy specifically relates directly to math, deliberately, like it's explicit. And look, he says things like by Zeus, like there's a lot of like invocation of the one highest god in the pantheon, right? It's like, which is very interesting. And that's like, least of all, by Zeus must we shrink back, right? It's like, what? That's your appeal? That's your that's where you're standing? That's your axiom? You're doing it on the authority of Zeus?
So they do kind of, in my mind, call back to some of the techniques they use in like chapter 2, I think, when they talking about the comparative advantage, like, it has the same feel of like chapter 2 when they say, and do not good practices lead to virtue and evil practices to vice? Assuredly. Still our old question of the comparative advantages of justice and injustice has not been answered. Which is more profitable, to be just and act justly and practice virtue? Right, this goes back to the 3 goods we established earlier in the book, right? Where they're saying, hey, remember we established these like relative like things? Well, now we have a little bit more tools in our tool bag to think about with. We can now think in tripartites. That's something that we weren't doing earlier, right? We have the ability to think about scale, right? So we're learning new ways of thinking and seeing to sort of advance the thought.
And then right after it's like his analogy of injustice being like a civil war between the parts. The rebellious part not That is like the part that's suited to being a slave, not wanting to be a slave and rebelling against the other parts, is what he brings up, right?
Do you have that section pulled up?
Yeah, that's the whole section about rebellion. Yeah, which is fascinating.
Is that the one? Must not injustice be a strife? Go ahead.
Now I suppose we must look for injustice. Your translation's probably different. Surely it must be a kind of civil war between the three parts. A meddling and doing of another's work. A rebellion by some part against the whole soul in order to rule it inappropriately.
Yeah,
And he's saying,
right after where we were reading, that's 444b.
Right.
and him saying right before that justice is each part doing its proper role,
Right.
but injustice would to rule all the other parts.
Do you want to read that section? I think this section's kind of key and a good one. Do you want to read the whole thing?
Rebellion by some part against the whole soul in order to rule it inappropriately. The rebellious part is by nature suited to being a slave, while the other part is not a slave but belongs to the ruling class. We'll say something like that, I suppose, and that the turmoil and straying of these parts are injustice, licentiousness, cowardice, ignorance, and another word, the whole of vice. And that like justice and injustice are related to healthy and unhealthy things for the body. Like justice would be the healthy things for the body, and injustice are the unhealthy things.
Right, but he's also asserting that things that can keep order are right to rule, and things that are rebellious or can't keep order should never rule.
What I think is interesting is that they define it as a strife among the three principles, right? Like, I mean, it's explicit. My translation translates to must not injustice be a strife which arises among the three principles. Oh, never mind. I'm sorry. I was thinking justice. I was in my mind they were saying that like it's kind of like struggling with God. Like if you're thinking about it seriously, maybe you're always in that state is what I thought they were saying, but that's not what they're saying. They're, it's not a he who struggles against God kind of a thing.
No, it's just the point that we can't do this because we're flawed. Right. That's how the chapter ends, right? That's on like the last page. It's like, yeah, we can't live this way because every man's confused and corrupted, right? And so nothing will enable him to acquire the virtue. And then Socrates says, yeah, it's ridiculous, but we've come from the place we were able to see most clearly that these things are so. We mustn't worry. Well, and then but so you too can see just how many forms vice, in my opinion, has. Those at least are worth looking at. In other words, oh, look, we found another bit of important detail in understanding this. There's more re-enchantment. It's more inflation of simple concepts.
Is that a sufficient definition for enchantment on inflation of a concept? Or is that just a component of enchantment? Enchantment. Is enchantment
Yes,
always...
enchantment is inflation.
That's all. Okay. That's not just a component of it. That's kind of at its core. Its core is inflation. Okay.
Like you thought this meant this, but really it can mean like this.
Okay.
Enchantment, the reciprocal opening that John talks about, that's enchantment.
Okay.
It's all it is. It's just, yeah, it's a fancy word for enchantment, or a fancy phrase for enchantment. And enchantment is supposed to encompass dimensionality, right? In other words, it's not my desk plus my desk and the microphone. It's my desk plus the possibility of everything that could be on my desk. That's enchantment. In other words, it's not a linear, direct one-to-one relationship. It's not merely additive. It's combinatorially explosive. It's like, oh yeah, you can experience all of this stuff. It's a new dimension. It's an added dimensional variable, not just an added value.
Yeah, it's interesting how they talk about the concept of discrete versus non-discrete, like in terms of the relativity argument when they mention up the relations. They say, like this is relative, and I mean that it's not disparate, right? Which is interesting, right? Like, yeah, we're not very good at doing that these days. Or I'm not. It's kind of difficult to think that way.
We're not, because everybody appeals to capital T truth. But if anybody makes a capital T truth claim, they get upset. It's right. And so, well, then you only have the relative now. Like, you're claiming you value the non-relative, but if somebody brings up something non-relative, you complain. And you're not complaining on grounds. You're not saying, no, that capital T truth is wrong because this capital T truth conflicts with it and it's right. which is the proper way to argue. They're just saying, no, that one's not right either. But now you're denying that any are right without, they're not doing that explicitly, but that's the implication. And so they're trapped in the relativism and claiming, no, we're not relativists. We have capital T truth. And it's like, okay, well, where is it? And that's where it all breaks down. You ask the easy question, as I said on my live stream last night about soothsaying. You ask the easy question, fine, where is that boundary? And they don't have an answer. It's like, well, then you don't believe in boundaries. You believe in the theoretical existence of boundaries, but when I ask you to draw one, you can't. So you don't believe in it. You can't participate in it. And that's how the chapter ends, right? Is wow, there must be as many types of the soul as there are regimes possessing distinct forms. Five regimes and 5 of the soul. And he claims he's described one, but it could be named in 2 ways. Right? If one exceptional man arose among the rulers, it would be called a kingship. If more, an aristocracy. Right? It's a very interesting setup. And there's an agreement on that point, right? So, and then it talks about it's many who arise, none of the city's laws are worth mentioning would be changed if he uses the rearing and education we described, right? In other words, and this rearing and education, initial conditions determine outcome, which is obviously false, but that's one of the axiomatic, is that, yeah, education solves these problems. And then they go back and forth, right? Because they're weeding out the guardians too. And the same thing's gonna happen later too, right? Is they're gonna be like, well, this philosopher king thing doesn't really work because maybe you can weed them out, but also you can't do that the next time around. Like, it's not a self-perpetuating system. It's a one-off. You got lucky.
Well, does anybody else? Do we want to conclude here, or does anybody have anything else?
I think that's literally. I read the end of the last page, so I think we're good. I think we can close out book 4.
All right.
You think we sufficiently teased apart justice?
No, I mean, I think maybe next week that there will be potential to come
Or at
and
least
see
what
things.
he's trying to say about justice in this book.
I definitely think there's more detail that since I don't think we were as prepared as we could have been. But I think, I think any detail that we miss will come out next week. That's relevant, or at least most of it. But we'll see.
Yeah, well, I mean, they didn't try to resolve justice. They said it doesn't work. I think that's the end of the book. It doesn't work. That's the end of the day. But yeah, I mean, for me, it really clarified all the second half that I really kind of struggled through. So that was.
So there's a lot of, sorry to cut you off, Mark. There's lots of connection that's pointing back to the nature of relativity to chapter 2. They bring up wealth and power. When they get into the heart and head thing, like they're bringing up things that were brought up before, but now in a different way, right? So I think that there could be some details in saying, hey, how we talked about this back then? Here's this again, and here's how they're exploring it in a little bit of a different manner. But
so Danny, you need to go to Lantern Jack's or Ancient Greece Declassified.com or whatever, and go through Jack's treatment of the Republic.
Okay.
Because he talks about how it's an onion, right? And it peels into the middle and then back out, so the outer chapters are similar to one another.
Right. Yeah. I definitely see it for sure. Yeah. No, I know you mentioned this Jack guy a lot. I'll have to. I don't know who he is. Is it Lantern Jack? I'll check him out.
Lantern Jack, yeah. Okay. Yeah, Ancient Greece Declassified is the name of his podcast and his website, I think, too. Yeah, Jack is brilliant. And Jack and I get along pretty well. So, yeah, he did a talk with Vervaeke on AI and Plato's Cave. It's a very good talk. So they were talking about, is Plato's Cave still relevant in the age of AI? And Jack says, oh, yeah, of course it is, right? And he's really, really good with this stuff.
Man with the mohawk, is that him?
Yeah. The standard protocol is just talk about what you got out, which I think we did. I mean, Casey didn't say anything, but we did. And then you just do the reflection, right?
Okay, so we'll talk about. I guess I would like to personally still like I don't think I explored, got what I wanted. I wanted to kind of get into their concept of self-control or kind of like motivation. I guess that's more of an adaptation of how I apply a lot of this stuff. Because just because I think I should take my life in a certain direction doesn't mean I'm going to get out of bed and actually, clean my room, let's say, So, perhaps that's an adaptation that's going to maybe take more time. But yeah, I mean, there's a lot of interleaving themes, threads that I see, but I think I'm going to have to do a little bit more work to get what I want out of it. So that's kind of my take on the second half of chapter 4. Need to work harder at it for me.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Anybody else have anything? Final thoughts?
Like I said, I just
Okay.
it was good to do this because I was struggling with it, and now I got a lot more appreciation for what it was they were up to. And yeah, I wish we'd had Ethan for longer, but that's okay. We'll get him back next week and see what he's got. What do you got for us, Casey?
I think coming through the idea of like proper relation of, you can call them parts, but like even just like different people in, let's call it like an organization or a hierarchy, like they're a proper relation. You have to be able to see that, and when it's being out of consonance in his idea of justice. So you can sort of pick apart things like something's going wrong in a hierarchy or an organization, just tell when someone's being unjust or something to that effect. I think it helping to notice how you could pick that apart a little bit more.
And seeing those things too, the first-hand stories, like when Mark said, hey, once upon a time there was this database issue, but hey, maybe it wasn't my authority to go fix it. Like hearing first-hand stories, I find very valuable, which is participating in a group like this. I actually, because like that's that's going to stick with me actually, even though it's a really trivial thing. And I already know this lesson in my head. It's just, it needs to be reinforced, especially, when you're at work every day and you have to figure out, is this my battle that I should be fighting? I remember one time Mark said, once upon a time there was a database issue, but maybe I can live with it, right? It's useful to have those firsthand experiences of, hey, here's how
A lot of things will get fixed without you mentioning them. It's just so all you're doing at that point is fighting over time.
All right, but it's good to know that I'm not the only one out there. Like maybe here's an example of how I applied wisdom, courage, and temperance, and maybe I made a mistake and then I learned from it. It's good to have that firsthand narrative of once upon a time. It helps to bring it into reality somehow in some way.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, you can relate to a story that somebody else participated in. Yeah.
So, all right. Well, if there's nothing else, then let's take a moment of reflection, and then we'll be done.
Yeah.
All right. So we'll pick up in chapter 5 next week.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it. Thanks, Danny.
Okay.
This is great.
Mm-hmm.